Joining us once again is economist Dean Baker. Dean is co-director of the Center for Economic and Policy Research in Washington, D.C., and one of the sanest people out there, especially in the world of economics. And as always, Dean, thanks so much for joining us.
Sure. Thanks a lot for having me on.
Listen, if I can, I want to ask you to help me make sense of what's going on with, on the one hand, I keep hearing that the jobs recovery is going strong, but economic growth is weak. And we've talked about this before, but it seems like these are two roads that have diverged in the woods and don't seem to be coming together. First of all, are the job numbers as good as the headlines say they are? And then we'll get to the second part.
Well, we are getting jobs. The problem has been, this has been throughout the recovery. A lot of them have been lower paying jobs in retail, trade, and restaurants. And, it's better than being unemployed, obviously, but these tend not to be jobs that people could support a family on. So, basically my view is because we aren't creating good jobs, people take what they can get, and, restaurants are happy to hire people, sometimes very experienced people with college degrees even, and paying them $8, $9, $10 an hour. So, mixed bag. Better those people have those jobs than they have nothing, but it's hard to get too excited about that. And that also explains the divergence between job growth and economic growth, because these are low pay, they're low productivity jobs. So we have people getting hired, but we have very weak productivity growth. It's really been quite striking. Productivity is the amount of output per hour of work, and if you have people working at low-paying jobs, then that's going to be bad, and that's the story we're seeing. So, very mixed story. Better to have jobs than not have them, but what we want to see is not just people have jobs, but that they have wages that could support themselves, support a family on, and to date, we don't see that to any great extent during the recovery.
So we had those decades of impressive, as I understand it, of impressive productivity growth. Now that's flattening out, and is so. So are you saying that that's pretty much, at least in part, a function of the fact that these are all lower paying jobs? Is there a connection there between the two?
Oh yeah, I think very much. I mean, the if we had a stronger economy, you would see more growth in higher paying sectors, manufacturing, construction, some of the higher paying services, say in healthcare. Healthcare is, of course, a mix. Some of them are very low paying, many of them are higher paying, so it's mixed bag. So there's plenty of high paying sectors in the economy, but they just haven't been growing very rapidly, and that pushes people into these low paying sectors, and that means weak productivity growth. And if the economy were to pick up more, you'd just see a lot of those jobs go away. I mean, I fly a lot, not something I'm happy about, but I do. And, you go into the airports and you see these stores where they're selling, shirts and ties and suits, and I probably bought something there. I get somewhere, I realize I didn't pack a tie, so you're really happy, but
Right.
how many people go in those stores over the course of a day? Not too many. They charge a huge price. What's the
Right.
productivity of the people working there? Not very
Right.
high. So, in the event suddenly wages, the labor market tightened and, workers were getting $15, $20 an hour, probably those stores would go out of business.
Got it. And so let me ask you then. You also, Dean Baker, you have a column called "Beat the Press," where you are constantly castigating our friends in the Fifth Estate for, rightfully so, for their lack of understanding of economic issues. Is part of the problem that we don't have more political demand for action to strengthen this recovery because we just hear these top line numbers that say X many jobs were created, and that sounds good enough to certain people, and they just drop the issue when really more is needed?
I think that's part of it, and I'd say a large part is that, when you get a sort of bifurcated economy like this, where you have some people are doing quite well, and then you have others that aren't doing very well. Well, the people who tend to be the ones who write the news stories tend to be among the group that are doing quite well. So these are people that have jobs, their friends have jobs, they're generally able to pay their mortgage. So, they're looking around, everything's fine. I don't know how many times people give me the stock market and you go, well, that's great if you own a lot of stock, but that's almost no one. And, invariably when I say that with reporters, they're really taken aback. What do you mean? I own stock. My friends own stock. I go, yeah, like I said, almost no one,
Right.
They really, you have a lot of people that are writing on economic issues that are like incredibly out of touch with, what the economy is for most of the country.
And then if you get from the reporter level to the columnist or commentator level, I think you've also jumped a couple more strata economically, I imagine, and you may be even more isolated.
Yeah, well, certainly when you're talking about the major newspapers, New York Times, Washington Post, usually you get to be a columnist at one of these places after having, worked as a reporter for a period of time, worked your way up, and it's really high status. And you're at that point hanging out with a different group. You aren't hanging out with the cub reporters who might be getting by on 40,000 a year or something. So
Right.
yeah, these people are the people they tend to hang out with. I always get a kick out of if you read Thomas Friedman, he's very proud of the fact that he hangs out with the Secretary of State and
Right.
so, and that's wonderful. But that's who his reference group is, except for the cab driver that takes him to and from things.
Tom Friedman, of course, he was on my mind too. Dean Baker, economist. Yeah, Tom Friedman has the most loquacious, informative, and Tom Friedman-like cab drivers of anybody I know. Statistically, the odds against that must be staggering, but yet there it is. But okay, so let's, if we can stipulate then that this recovery is not the kind of jobs we'd like to see, nor probably the overall numbers we'd like to see, but certainly the numbers are stronger. Then that gets us to what you wrote recently about a couple weeks ago about deficit hawks and the Federal Reserve. And so, is there something the Federal Reserve should be doing that it isn't? There something it shouldn't be doing that it might?
Well, there's a couple of things going on with the Fed. The Fed has tried to boost the economy with its zero interest rate policy, with its quantitative easing, where it's tried to lower short-term interest rates, and that has definitely given a boost to the economy. Obviously, it's not gotten us back to full employment or anything like that, but it's what the Fed could do. Could they have done more? I would have liked to see them try more, just in a simple reason. There's not really a downside to it, So had they done more quantitative easing by $5 trillion rather than $3 trillion? Paul Krugman has thrown out the idea: why don't they target a higher rate of inflation, saying, "Hey, we're trying to get 3% inflation. We're really going to go great guns to try and do that." Others have suggested that as well. So I would like to have seen them try to do something like that, because there doesn't seem to be a downside. Politically, would they have taken a lot of heat for that? Probably, surely. Also, important thing to remember: we always personify the Fed. We saw Ben Bernanke there, and now Janet Yellen. It's not they alone don't call the shots. You have the Open Market Committee with 12 people on it. 7 are appointees of the president. The other 5 rotating bank presidents, the
Right.
regional bank presidents. Many of those people are very conservative, particularly the bank presidents. So. Could the Fed have done more? Well, in principle, yes, but given the politics of the Fed and, where it sits in the U.S., perhaps not. So I'd like to see them do more. They didn't, whatever. What I worry about now is that they're going to go the other way, and this is the whole story of raising interest rates. And, people
Right.
have to understand that. Raising interest rates means trying to keep people from getting jobs. And, it's not that I think they're, Mr. Burns from The Simpsons with his hands, going excellent as they throw people out of work. The issue is they're worried about inflation. Obviously, with lower unemployment, there's more risk of inflation than with higher unemployment. I mean, it just kind of stands to reason. Workers have more bargaining power. They get higher wages. More risk of it doesn't mean you'll have inflation, but there's greater risk. So if you aren't that concerned about people being out of work, you are very worried about inflation, you start to raise interest rates to try and slow the economy. So the Fed is going to do that. We don't know whether, some people say it might be as early as September, maybe December. I hope as late as possible. And more important than the initial rate hike, I mean, that will not be good, but, it's a quarter percentage point, presumably, and that won't be that big a deal. The more important issue is what they do going forward. So if we get a statement from the Fed to the effect, okay, we're going to raise interest rates a quarter point at every meeting, basically every 6 weeks, that would be very bad news, because that would be tightening up a lot and certainly slowing the economy, slowing the rate of job growth. So that's my big concern, that, they'll start raising rates. They might do it very quickly, and that will certainly slow the economy in a context where really I'd like to see them put their foot further to the accelerator.
Are they getting mixed signals from the economy in the sense that growth is so weak or perhaps non-existent at times, and yet job growth is pretty good? Does it matter whether they look out of one eye or the other in the sense?
Well, they're looking at a range of data, and certainly the fact that we had negative growth in the first quarter. I mean, it's just minus 0.2. We got new data on it, so it wasn't a plunge, and it was clearly due to weather. I mean, I was the first to. I should say I was the first, but I mean, I was among the first. I said that from the beginning. Clearly it wasn't just the economy is falling through the floor. We had bad weather, and that was obviously the main factor. But the point is, we clearly don't have an economy that's growing rapidly. And so they'll look to the GDP number, and of course they'll look to the individual components. What's going on with consumption? What does the housing market look like? What does the car market look like? What's going on with different types of investment? So they're looking at a range of data, and most of those, from my view and not mine alone, look pretty weak. But yeah, if you look at the job market, you go, well, we're still creating jobs at a pretty rapid clip. And those who are worried about the labor market getting too tight, they could point to that and go, well, if this keeps going, then we're going to have a tight labor market, and by some measures, the unemployment rate, 5.4 or 5.5, that's not too high. So you could say, well, that's getting kind of low. And there's a lot of economists who would say, well, we shouldn't have an unemployment rate that's below 5.2, 5.3, 5.4%, because that would mean we have too tight a labor market. Again, I think that view is nuts, but there are a lot of economists who think something like that.
So we're talking with Dean Baker, economist, and I guess this goes back, as with higher, more successful journalists, this goes back to a certain insularity of worldview too, doesn't it? Where they see a world and they exist in a world where, for example, interest rates may be of more significance and more personal relevance than rates of unemployment.
Well, I think it's more the issue of inflation rates that they're concerned about than interest rates per se. So if they're raising the interest rate, I mean, I know there are some people who are saying, oh, people want to get higher interest on their savings. Sure, but most of the people have a lot of savings, also have money in the stock market. So the reality is that they've done quite well since stock market has risen so much over the last 5 years. So I think the main issue, if they're raising interest rates, is that they're trying to ensure that inflation doesn't start to increase.
Got it. And as long as we're talking about worldviews, one thing that I can't resist asking you about, because I've been watching this from the start with such astonishment, speaking of what seemed to me to be insular worldviews, the negotiations in Greece, they don't seem to be going well. And do you share the view that a number of people have formed that the IMF in particular is being extremely recalcitrant in this whole thing?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the reality is Greece is not going to pay back the debt. So people were expecting Greece to pay back the debt. There's no way on earth they're going to do it. And they suffered horribly, So when we hear people saying, well, Greece is going to have to endure the pain, you go, they have been enduring the pain. It's been worse than the Great Depression. Their economy has shrank by more than 25%. Their unemployment rate is around 25%. Youth unemployment's 50%. So the idea that Greece has to endure pain, it's close to nuts. They've endured an incredible amount of pain. Their government's already made huge budget cuts on the order of 13% of GDP. In the U.S., that'd be on the order of about $2.5 trillion annually. So that's not, people often talk about 10-year numbers. No, that's a single-year number. So they've gone through an enormous amount of pain. So demanding further pain from them is, to my view, almost obscene. And I frankly, don't understand, the narrow politics, how Syriza, the ruling, the government in Greece, how they could bring this about. They have to answer their population. They didn't say they were going to get off the euro. But to my view, they have no alternative. They would be crazy not to get off the euro, because any scenario where they stay on the euro is another decade of more than double digit, probably 20% unemployment. And I just don't understand how you could do that to a country. So I think, I don't know whether it's the IMF's intention to make them default, make them leave the euro. My guess is that they may not care. Although I suspect they will be very concerned if they do leave the euro, because they may not be foresight enough to see this, and they've shown an incredible lack of foresight, the last decade. So that might sound stupid, but they've been up to that level of stupidity. If Greece were to leave the euro, they suddenly become hyper competitive, and of course their big industry is tourism. I think you'd see Spain and Portugal very unhappy 6 months, a year down, if Greece were to leave the euro, because a hell of a lot of people would otherwise be vacationing in Greece and Portugal. I mean, Spain and Portugal would be going to Greece instead, and I don't think they'd be very happy about that.
Part of what's amazed me with the Greece situation too, and the position the IMF has taken, is they seem to be pushing not only a level of pain, to use that word, additional pain, but the nature of the pain. For example, no more taxes. It's got to be in the form of cuts, additional cuts. So they're specifying where to inflict the pain and how to inflict the pain. So I know that people have even wondered whether they're trying to send a message to other coalitions like Syriza and other countries. Um, but
Yeah,
it
they've
is
been insisting that they make big cuts, and the government there actually had proposed cuts to the military, and they said no, we're not interested in that. We want you to cut the pensions, and of course
right.
they have hugely cut the pensions, and the most Greek pensioners get less than I think it's 600 euros a month. 600 euros translates $700. I mean, so the idea that they have these generous pensions, some people do retire relatively early. Got a point there, maybe, because some of these people are construction workers, other jobs they're very physically demanding. But that aside, let's say the retirement age should be raised, perhaps. But these are not generous pensions. And I just looked it up. You have IMF senior economists that could retire at age 55 with pensions of 100,000 a year.
Right.
And guess what? Those guys might be very smart, but they don't do a very good job because they didn't see any of this coming, and they grossly underestimated how much harm their austerity program would do to Greece. So maybe very smart, but they don't show evidence of that on the job.
They don't have pay for performance contracts, but they have contracts that perform well. So this is what I count on you for, Dean Baker, is that kind of, well, let's take a look at the pension plan for IMF economists. All right. Well, as always, thanks so much for coming on the program and giving us some insight into these issues.
Thanks a lot for having me on, Richard.
You bet. Dean Baker, economist. We will be right back after this. I am Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour.